My son-in-law looked me dead in the eyes and said, "We didn't invite you because we knew you'd make it about yourself." That was a Thursday afternoon in my own kitchen. I had driven 40 minutes to bring them a casserole because my daughter had told me she wasn't feeling well. I was standing there holding a glass dish covered in foil, still warm from the oven, and those were the first words out of his mouth. I didn't say anything. I set the dish down on the counter, nodded once, and drove home. 7 days later, he texted me asking if I could cover 3 months of their back rent. I want to tell you exactly what happened. All of it. Because I spent a long time being ashamed of how I handled things. And then I spent even longer being ashamed that I wasn't ashamed enough. It took me almost 2 years to understand that those are two very different problems. My name is Robert. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county. Roads, drainage systems, bridge inspections. I retired at 61 with a pension, a paid-off house in Raleigh, North Carolina, and what I thought was a pretty solid relationship with my only child. My daughter's name is Claire. She's 31 now. I raised her alone from the time she was 9 years old, after her mother passed from ovarian cancer. I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't want it to sound like I'm building a case for myself. But I think you need to understand the foundation of what I'm describing. It was just the two of us for over 20 years. I coached her soccer teams. I sat in the parking lot of her college dorm for 2 hours after move-in day because I didn't want to go home to an empty house. I flew to Portland for her graduate school graduation, even though I had a stress fracture in my left foot, and the doctor told me not to. I went anyway. I wore a boot, and I sat in the bleachers, and I cried when they called her name. I'm telling you this, not to make her the villain. I'm telling you this because what happened later makes no sense without this part. She met Marcus about 4 years ago. He was working as a freelance graphic designer at the time, which is a fine thing to do. I have nothing against that. He was 34 when they started dating, and he seemed confident. Charming, even at first. He had a lot of opinions, and he stated them loudly, and for a while I mistook that for intelligence. The first time I got a real read on him was Thanksgiving, maybe 8 months into their relationship. We were talking about the housing market. I know, it's a tired topic, but I have a professional background in infrastructure, and I care about it. And Marcus interrupted me mid-sentence to tell me I didn't understand how things worked anymore. I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly. What he actually said was, "No offense, but that's a pretty boomer take." And then he laughed, like he'd said something clever. Claire laughed too. I let it go. I told myself he was young. He was still figuring out how to be around people. And Claire seemed happy. She was happy. I could see it. So I kept my mouth shut and I focused on that. Over the next year and a half, I helped them in ways that felt natural to me at the time. When their car needed a new transmission, I paid for it. About $2,200. When they moved into a bigger apartment in Cary, I paid the security deposit and first month's rent because they were short. That was $1,600. When Claire needed a new laptop for her job, I bought it. When Marcus mentioned offhand that he was trying to build out a proper home office and needed equipment, I sent him a check for $800. He thanked me exactly once in a text, and the text said, "Thanks, ma'am." That was it. I want to be honest about something. I didn't do any of that because I felt pressured. I did it because I wanted to. Claire was my daughter and I had money I wasn't spending, and it made me feel useful to help. I think a lot of parents my age understand that feeling. The kids are grown, they don't need you the same way anymore, and helping financially is one of the ways you still feel like a father. I understand now that I was filling a need of my own, not just theirs. That's important. I didn't see it then. Things started to shift about a year before the incident. Marcus had stopped getting regular client work. The freelance design business had slowed down, he said, because of AI tools. Which, fair enough, that's a real thing happening in that industry. But his response to the slowdown was to do less, not more. He stopped reaching out for new clients. He started sleeping until noon. Claire was working full-time as a pediatric occupational therapist, doing good work, making decent money, and she was also cooking most of their meals and handling most of their household expenses on her own. I know this because Claire told me, not complaining exactly, more like reporting, the way you report something to someone you trust because you need to say it out loud to someone who loves you. She never said I'm unhappy or I need help. She just described her life in a way that made me worried. I asked her once gently whether Marcus was looking for work. She said he was exploring his options. I didn't push it. What I should have done is talk to her directly about what I was seeing. What I did instead was quietly keep helping financially, which I now understand was the wrong call. Every time I covered something, I made it a little easier for the situation to stay exactly as it was. I smoothed over the problem instead of helping her look at it clearly. I didn't realize any of that until much later. The call came on a Sunday morning in March. I was on my back porch drinking coffee and reading. My phone buzzed, and it was Marcus calling, not Claire, Marcus, which was unusual enough that I picked up immediately, thinking something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. He was calling to let me know that he and Claire had gotten married the day before. I didn't understand what he'd said at first. I actually asked him to repeat it. He said it again, casually, like he was telling me the weather. Yeah, we went down to the courthouse yesterday. Kept it small, just a few friends. I asked where Claire was. He said she was in the shower. I asked why she hadn't called me. There was a pause, and then he said, "We wanted to keep it low-key. Didn't want a lot of family energy, you know. Just wanted it to be about us." I stayed on the phone for another minute or two. I don't remember exactly what I said. I think I said something like, "I see, and I hope you're both happy." I hung up and I sat on that porch for probably an hour without moving. My daughter had gotten married the day before. She hadn't called me before. She hadn't called me after. Her husband was the one telling me the morning after, between her shower and whatever they had planned for the day. I need to tell you something about what that felt like, because I don't think I can explain the rest of the story without being honest about this. It wasn't just hurt. It was a particular kind of erasure, like being shown a photograph of your own life and realizing you've been cropped out of it. Every soccer game, every hospital waiting room, every night I sat outside her college dorm, every flight I took with a broken foot. All of that, and I wasn't important enough to have even gotten a text the morning of. I didn't call her that day. I needed time to figure out what I even wanted to say. She called me 2 days later. The conversation was short. She said she was sorry I felt left out, but that it was her wedding and her choice. She said Marcus and she had decided together that they wanted something private. She said she hoped I could understand. I told her I loved her. I told her I needed a little time. She said okay. That was essentially the last real conversation we had for several weeks. Then came the text from Marcus. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 8 days after the wedding. I was at my workbench in the garage, doing nothing in particular, just keeping my hands busy. My phone lit up, and I saw his name and I felt something tighten in my chest before I even read it. The text said, "Hey Robert, so we're actually pretty behind on rent. 3 months. Landlord's been patient, but he's at his limit. We're looking at around $5,400. Would really appreciate your help." That was the whole message. No preamble, No acknowledgement of anything. No, I know this is a strange time to ask. Just the number and the request. I put my phone face down on the workbench. I picked up a piece of sandpaper and I stood there and I thought about the last 8 days. I thought about that Saturday morning phone call. I thought about a few friends. I thought about family energy. I thought about make it about yourself. I thought about 31 years of being someone's only parent. And I thought about the $2,200 transmission, the security deposit, the laptop, the $800 for the home office. The total, which I had never added up before that moment, but which I now calculated in my head, somewhere over $6,000 in the past 2 years alone, not counting what I'd given Claire over her whole life. I thought about all of it, and then I texted back. I said, I'm not going to be able to help with that. That was it. No explanation, no apology, no I wish things were different. I had spent 63 years over-explaining myself to people, and I was done with it. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Marcus. I let it ring. He called again. I let that one ring too. Then Claire called. I answered. She was upset. Not crying, but that particular tone people get when they're trying to sound calm and it's not quite working. She said she understood I was hurt about the wedding, but that this was serious, that they could lose their apartment, and that she really needed me to put aside my feelings right now, because this was an emergency. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt in that moment, because my first instinct was to give in. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct, the one that came from 31 years of being her father, was to say, okay, send me the details, I'll handle it. That instinct was so strong it was almost physical, but underneath it, something had shifted. Something that had been loose for a while had finally come apart. I said, Claire, I love you, but I'm not going to help with the rent. She asked me why. I said, I think you and Marcus need to work this one out on your own. She said, Dad, we can't. That's why I'm calling you. I said, I know. There was a long silence. Then she said, so you're punishing me for the wedding. I thought about that for a second because I wanted to answer honestly and not just reactively. And my honest answer was, no, I wasn't. Or at least, that wasn't the whole answer. The wedding was the moment I finally saw something clearly that had been blurry for a long time. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. I told her, I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just not going to keep doing what I've been doing. She hung up. Marcus sent me 2 more texts that evening. The first one said they had always been grateful for my help, and he didn't understand why I was doing this. The second one said, and I want to be precise here because the wording still sits with me, you're really going to let your daughter get evicted over a grudge? I read that text twice. I did not respond. 2 days later, they showed up at my house. Both of them. It was a Saturday morning, and I saw Marcus's car pull into my driveway, and I stood in my kitchen, and I made a decision. I was going to answer the door. I was going to be calm. I was not going to get into a long argument, and I was not going to write a check. Marcus did most of the talking. He stood in my doorway, and he explained their situation. The back rent, the landlord's deadline, the fact that Claire was working as much as she could but couldn't cover it alone. He made it sound reasonable and serious and like a problem that any decent father-in-law would simply solve. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, I said, I hear you. I'm not going to help with the rent. He stared at me. Claire was standing slightly behind him. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the ground. Marcus said, why not? What's your reason? I said, I don't think I need to give you a reason. And that's when his tone changed. He said, again, I want to be precise. You know what? I think this is about control. You've always wanted to control Claire, and now that she made a decision without you, you're punishing her financially. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at my daughter. She still wasn't looking at me. I said, I think you both should go. Marcus said, so that's it? You're just done? I said, I'm going to close the door now. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway and I listened to them get into the car. I heard the engine start. I heard them back out of the driveway, and then I stood there in the quiet of my own house. And I waited to feel something. Relief, guilt, grief. I wasn't sure which one was coming. What came was something closer to grief, if I'm honest. Not for the money, not for the confrontation, but the image of Claire standing in my doorway, not looking at me. That image stayed with me for a long time. I called my brother that afternoon. He's 4 years older than me, lives in Asheville. He listened to the whole story without saying much, and when I finished, he asked me one question. He said, "Do you think you did the right thing?" I said I didn't know yet. He said that was probably the most honest answer. In the weeks after, I found out from Claire's aunt, my late wife's sister, Claire is still close with, that Marcus and Claire had ended up borrowing the money from Marcus's parents. They didn't lose the apartment. I was relieved about that, genuinely. Whatever I thought of Marcus, I didn't want my daughter homeless. I also found out, through that same aunt, that Marcus's parents had not been happy about it. That they had words with Marcus about the situation. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask for them. About 6 weeks after the Saturday confrontation, Claire texted me. She said she'd been thinking a lot and that she wanted to talk. We met for coffee at a place near her work. She came alone. We sat across from each other, and for a few minutes neither of us said much. She looked tired. She had always been someone who could make her face unreadable when she wanted to, and she was doing that now. She said, I shouldn't have let Marcus make that call to you. About the wedding, I mean. I should have called you myself. I said, yes, you should have, she said. I don't have a good explanation for why I didn't. I was nervous about your reaction. And then Marcus suggested we just do it and tell people after, and I went along with it. I know that was wrong. I asked her if she thought it was wrong or if she thought I was upset, and she took a moment with that question. She said, both. I think both. That was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something. I didn't bring up the money. She didn't either. We talked about other things. Her job, my retirement project of redoing the back patio, her aunt's health. Normal things. It was a little stilted. The way conversations are when you're both working around a large object in the room. But we stayed for 90 minutes. She hugged me before she left. That was 8 months ago. Things are better now, slowly. She calls more often than she did. Marcus and I are cordial when we're in the same room, which isn't often. I don't know what their financial situation looks like currently, and I haven't asked. I've helped with nothing since that spring, not because I'm withholding love, but because I finally understand that for a long time I was using money to express feelings I should have just said out loud, and they were using my willingness to give it as a substitute for the harder work of building a real life. I don't have a clean ending for this. I want to be honest about that too, because the honest version is more useful than the satisfying version. My daughter and I are finding our way back to each other, carefully, on different terms than before. That's real. That matters. But I also sit on my back porch sometimes in the morning with my coffee, and I think about that 9-year-old girl I was suddenly alone with, and how certain I was that I would do right by her, and how much I still don't know if I did. What I know for sure is this. There is a version of loving someone where you keep giving them what they ask for because you're afraid that if you stop, they'll stop loving you back. I did that for years. I called it support. I called it being a good father. And it was those things sometimes, but it was also fear. My fear, dressed up as generosity. The day I closed that door, I was afraid too. But it was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of someone who has finally decided that their own dignity is worth protecting. That's a fear I can live with. If you're a parent listening to this right now and something in this story sounds familiar, I'm not here to tell you what to do. But I want to say one thing. Clearly, the love you have for your child is real. Your willingness to sacrifice for them is real. But a relationship where you give everything and ask for nothing, not even basic respect, is not a relationship. It's an arrangement. And arrangements can end. They should end. Sometimes. And ending them is not the same thing as stopping the love. It took me a long time to understand that. I'm still learning it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any grand philosophical way, just the quiet, practical kind of thinking you do when you're sitting alone on a back porch with nothing but time and coffee and the particular silence of a house that used to have more people in it. The truth is, nothing that happened with Marcus came out of nowhere. I just wasn't willing to see it building. Every time I wrote a check without a conversation, every time I let a condescending comment slide because Claire seemed happy, every time I told myself, he's young, he'll grow out of it, I was making a choice, a small one maybe, but choices accumulate. They become the walls of the room you eventually find yourself standing in. What I understand now is that Marcus didn't become disrespectful the day he told me I'd embarrass them at their own wedding. He'd been telling me who he was for years. The difference is that I had been too busy being useful to actually listen. And Claire. I want to be careful here because she's my daughter and I love her without condition. Claire learned something from watching me that I never intended to teach. She learned that love from me had no floor, that there was no version of her behavior that would cost her my support. I thought I was showing her unconditional love. What I was actually showing her was that she didn't have to earn basic respect in order to receive my help. Those are not the same lesson, and I taught her the wrong one for a long time. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody tells you when you're in the middle of raising a kid. The effects don't show up right away. You make a decision in 2003 and you see the consequence of it in 2024. By then, the connection is hard to trace. It's easier to look at your adult child and think, where did this come from, than to sit quietly and ask, what did I do or not do that made this possible? I'm not saying Marcus's behavior was my fault. What I'm saying is that my willingness to absorb it without responding. That part was on me. The day I closed that door, I wasn't being cold, I was finally being honest. Honest about what I would accept, honest about what I wouldn't, and honest about the fact that being a good father doesn't mean being endlessly available as a financial resource to people who have decided your presence is an embarrassment. There's a version of strength that looks like giving, and there's a version of strength that looks like stopping. I spent 61 years practicing the first one. The second one I had to learn from scratch, standing in my own hallway, listening to a car back out of my driveway. I don't think intelligence means having all the right answers. I think it means being willing to look at the consequences of your own choices without flinching, even when what you see is uncomfortable. And I think real resilience isn't about never getting knocked down. It's about getting honest with yourself first, before anyone else. I'm still working on all three of those things. I don't expect to have them figured out before I die, but I'm working on them. And that, I've decided, is enough.